The restaurant was still pretending it was festive. Soft lights hung in the windows, small and warm, like they were trying their best. A plastic wreath leaned crooked on the door. Somewhere in the back, a speaker played old Christmas music at a low volume, the kind meant to fill silence without asking anything in return. Daniel Mercer sat alone at a table for four. His coat was folded neatly on the chair beside him. He had done that out of habit, not because anyone was coming. The chair across from him was empty. The other two were empty too, clean, untouched. The waiter had already come by twice to ask if he wanted anything else. Daniel had said no both times. His plate was still mostly full. The food had gone cold, but he hadn't noticed when that happened. Outside the window, snow moved sideways in thin lines. Not enough to look dramatic, just enough to remind him it was Christmas. Daniel didn't check his phone. He already knew there would be nothing there. No missed calls. No messages. His assistant had stopped sending reminders after noon. Even she knew better than to schedule anything tonight. He lifted his glass of water and took a small sip. Put it back down in the exact same place. Across the room, families leaned toward each other. A man laughed too loudly at something his brother said. A woman wiped gravy from a child's chin with a napkin that had clearly already been used once. Someone dropped a fork. Someone else bent to pick it up. Daniel watched it all like he was behind glass. This wasn't the first Christmas he'd spent alone. It wasn't even the worst. There had been hotel rooms in foreign cities, catered dinners eaten out of plastic containers, late-night flights where the holiday passed somewhere over the Atlantic. But this one felt heavier. Maybe it was because he was 60 now, or because his office building had gone quiet in a way it never used to, or because, for the first time, he hadn't even pretended there was somewhere else he needed to be. He had come here because it was close, because it was open, because sitting in his apartment, with the lights off, had felt worse. The bell above the restaurant door jingled, cold air rushed in, sharp and sudden. A young couple stepped inside, brushing snow from their coats. Between them was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7. She wore a red sweater that was slightly too big, the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. Her hair was tied back with a green ribbon that had come loose on one side. She stopped just inside the door and looked around, not in the distracted way kids usually do, not scanning for toys or decorations. She looked at faces, tables. Who was sitting with who? Her eyes landed on Daniel. He felt it immediately, that strange, uncomfortable sense of being seen when you haven't prepared yourself to be. The parents were busy with the host, asking about wait times. The girl slipped her hand free and took a few steps forward before either of them noticed. She walked straight toward Daniel's table. Daniel straightened without realizing it, smoothed a crease in his sleeve. He assumed she'd stop or turn or be called back. She didn't. She stood beside his table, close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose. Her cheeks were pink from the cold. She looked at the empty chairs. Then she looked at him. "You're alone," she said. It wasn't rude. It wasn't curious. It was just an observation. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again. He wasn't sure what the correct response was to a child stating a fact. "Yes," he said finally. She frowned slightly, like she was trying to solve a small puzzle. "It's Christmas," she said. "Yes," Daniel said again. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The restaurant noise swelled and dipped around them. Plates clinked. Someone laughed again. The girl tilted her head. "Do you want to have dinner with us?" The words landed softly. No drama, no build-up, just a question. Daniel felt something shift in his chest, not sharply. More like the slow loosening of a knot he hadn't known was there. Before he could answer, her mother hurried over. "Oh, Emily, I'm so sorry," she said, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "We don't bother people." Emily looked up at her. "He's alone." "I know, sweetheart, but—" Daniel stood up. It surprised all three of them. "That's all right," he said quickly. "I don't mind." The mother hesitated, embarrassed. She does this sometimes. I'm really sorry." Daniel shook his head. "No need to be," she asked very politely. Emily smiled like this was proof of something she'd already known. The father joined them then, a little out of breath. He took in the scene, the empty chairs, Daniel standing there in his pressed coat and expensive watch. "Oh," he said. "Hi." "Hi," Daniel replied. There was an awkward pause, the kind adults fill with apologies or jokes. Emily didn't wait for it to pass. "We're sitting over there," she said, pointing to a table near the window. "There's an extra chair." Daniel looked where she pointed. It was true. The table was set for 4, but there were only 3 of them. He thought of the cold food in front of him, the folded coat, the quiet apartment waiting for him later. "I wouldn't want to intrude," he said, and meant it. "You wouldn't," the father said automatically. Then he stopped, looked at his wife. She took a breath. "Let it out slowly. If you'd like," she said. "We'd be happy to have you." Daniel hesitated. He felt the weight of who he was, of how strange this might look. A stranger, an older man, a family he didn't know. Emily was already pulling out the extra chair. He nodded. "All right," he said. They moved tables. The waiter helped, curious but silent. Daniel carried his plate over, feeling oddly like a guest in his own life. They introduced themselves. The father was Mark. The mother was Sarah. The girl was Emily, which Daniel already knew. "I'm Daniel," he said. No last name. He almost gave it, then didn't. They sat. For a few minutes, no one spoke. Forks scraped softly against plates. Emily swung her legs under the table. Daniel felt aware of everything, how he held his utensils, how much space he took up, the sound of his breathing. Then Emily leaned toward him. "What do you do?" she asked. Mark winced. "Emily, it's okay," Daniel said. "I work in an office." Emily considered that. "Like Santa?" Daniel smiled before he could stop himself. "Not quite." She nodded, satisfied. As the meal went on, conversation found its way in slowly. Not forced, just small things. The snow, the food, the fact that the restaurant was busier than they'd expected. Daniel answered when asked. Asked back when he remembered to. He found himself laughing once, quietly, surprised by the sound. When the check came, Mark reached for it. Daniel let him. It felt important that he did. As they stood to leave, Sarah touched Daniel's arm. "I'm glad you joined us," she said. "Really." "So am I," Daniel replied. Emily hugged him without warning. "Bye," she said. "Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas," he said back. They left, bells ringing again, cold air rushing in. Daniel sat back down at his table, his original one, alone again. But the chair across from him felt different now. He finished his meal. Outside, the snow had started to fall straight down. And for the first time that night, Daniel didn't feel quite so invisible. Daniel didn't go straight home after the restaurant. He stood outside for a while, collar turned up, letting the cold settle into him. Snow gathered on the shoulders of his coat and stayed there. He didn't brush it off. The city felt slower tonight, like it had agreed to pause out of respect for something unspoken. He walked without a clear direction at first. Past closed shops with dark windows, past apartments where warm light spilled through curtains. He noticed small things he usually missed, the way a string of lights blinked unevenly, the muffled sound of a piano somewhere above street level, the smell of pine drifting from a sidewalk stand that was packing up for the night. He thought about Emily's voice. Not the words. The tone. The way she had stated things plainly, as if loneliness were just another observable fact, like snow or empty chairs. When he reached his building, the doorman nodded and wished him a Merry Christmas. Daniel nodded back, his hands full of keys and thoughts. Upstairs, the apartment greeted him with its usual silence. It was large, clean, everything in its place, the kind of place magazines like to photograph. Nothing was wrong with it, and that was part of the problem. No shoes by the door that weren't his, no coats on the hooks, no notes on the counter. Daniel set his keys down and took off his coat. He paused, then hung it carefully, smoothing the fabric the way he always did. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the counter without drinking it. The night stretched in front of him. He told himself he should sleep. He had meetings after the holiday. Emails would be waiting. There was always something. Instead, he sat down on the couch and stared at the blank television screen. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to think about why nights like this felt heavier now. He'd learned how to stay busy, how to fill time, how to let days slide into each other without friction. But tonight, something had shifted. Just enough. He thought about his ex-wife, Claire, not in a sharp way, more like a distant ache. They had met when he was still climbing, when success felt uncertain and exciting. She had liked that version of him, or maybe she'd liked who she thought he would be. They hadn't fought much when it ended. That was what surprised people. No yelling, no betrayal, just a slow realization that they were no longer moving in the same direction. She had wanted children. Daniel had said maybe later, maybe when things slowed down. Things never did. He hadn't spoken to her in years. He heard through someone else that she had moved out of state, that she had a family now, that she seemed happy. He hoped it was true. Daniel slept poorly. He woke before dawn, the apartment still dark. His mind already busy with unfinished thoughts. He lay there longer than usual, listening to the distant hum of traffic, until the sky outside his windows began to lighten. On Christmas morning, he made coffee and drank it standing up. He had no plans. He hadn't wanted any. By noon, the quiet pressed in again. He considered ordering food, considered going back out, considered calling someone, then dismissed the idea. He wasn't sure who he would call or what he would say. Instead, he found himself opening a drawer he rarely touched. Inside were old things, photos, programs from events long over, a folded card with Claire's handwriting on it. He didn't open it. Just held it for a moment, then put it back. His phone buzzed. Daniel frowned. It almost never buzzed on holidays. A message from his assistant, Karen. "Hope you're having a peaceful Christmas. Just wanted to flag. There's a note from the community outreach team you might want to see when you're back." Daniel stared at the screen. Community outreach wasn't his area. He funded things. He signed off on budgets. He didn't usually read notes unless something had gone wrong. What kind of note? He typed back. A few seconds passed. "They mentioned a local family you met last night. Something about a restaurant?" Daniel's fingers stilled. "I met a family," he wrote. Briefly. Another pause. The little girl's mother emailed the foundation address. Just gratitude, no requests. Daniel set the phone down. He felt exposed suddenly, as if a private moment had wandered into a public space without his permission. He didn't respond. Later that afternoon, he went for a walk. He didn't know why. He just needed movement. The city was quieter than usual, streets dotted with people heading somewhere together. He passed the restaurant from the night before. It was closed now, chairs stacked, lights off. Daniel stood across the street, hands in his pockets, watching his breath cloud in front of him. He thought about Emily again, about how easily she had bridged the distance between strangers, how little effort it had taken her to notice something he'd spent years ignoring. He didn't see the family again. Of course he didn't. That evening he ate leftovers alone and went to bed early. The next few days slid back into routine. The city woke up, offices reopened, emails multiplied. Daniel stepped back into his role with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it too long. But something had changed. He noticed things now. The empty chair in conference rooms, the way people avoided eye contact in elevators, the pause before someone spoke when they weren't sure if they were allowed to. During one meeting, he caught himself staring out the window instead of at the presentation screen. Snow had melted into gray slush on the sidewalks. People hurried past, shoulders hunched. Daniel? He looked back at the table. Sorry. Go on. Later that week, he opened the email Karen had mentioned. It was short, polite. Sarah had written, She thanked the foundation for supporting local initiatives. She mentioned how kind Daniel had been to join them for dinner. She said Emily still talked about him, about how the man wasn't lonely anymore because we shared Christmas. There was no ask, no hint of expectation. Daniel closed the email and sat quietly for a long time. He thought about how easily moments passed without leaving a mark, how rare it was for something small to linger. That evening he stayed late at the office, not because he needed to, but because the building felt less empty than his apartment. As he was leaving, he passed the bulletin board near the elevators. It held flyers for charity drives and volunteer opportunities, most of them blurred together. One caught his eye, a handwritten sign, simple, community dinner, Thursdays, families welcome. Daniel stopped. He read it twice. He didn't tear it down. He didn't take a photo, but he remembered where it was. And for the first time in a long while, he wondered what he might do with a Thursday night. Daniel didn't go to the community dinner that Thursday. He told himself he was busy. There had been a late meeting, a report that needed revising, a call from overseas that ran long. All of it was true, but none of it was the real reason. The real reason was simpler. He didn't know how to walk into a place where people went to be seen. Still, the flyer stayed in his mind. The next week, he found himself checking the time around 6 o'clock. Not intentionally, just a glance, then another. At 6:30, he shut down his computer. Karen looked up from her desk. Heading out early? He nodded. Something like that. She smiled. Surprised but pleased. Enjoy your evening. Daniel took the elevator down alone. In the lobby, he paused, then turned toward the street instead of the garage. The community center was only 6 blocks away. He walked slowly, his hands buried in his coat pockets, rehearsing nothing in particular. He didn't know what he expected. Folding tables, long lines, the faint smell of overcooked food. Inside, it was warmer than he thought it would be. Not just the temperature, the sound. Voices overlapped, chairs scraped. Someone laughed loudly near the back. A pot lid clanged. Children moved through the room like loose threads, weaving between adults who pretended not to worry. Daniel stood just inside the door, suddenly aware of how out of place he looked. His coat was too nice, his shoes too clean. He considered turning around. Hey, a man in his 30s stood nearby, holding a stack of plates. He wore a sweater with a coffee stain on the sleeve and an easy smile. "You here to eat or help?" the man asked. Daniel hesitated. "I'm not sure." The man nodded like that made perfect sense. "You can do both. Plates are over there, food's that way. Sit wherever there's space." He handed Daniel 2 plates and moved on. Daniel stood there for a second, then followed the flow of the room. He served himself stew and bread and found an empty chair at a long table. Across from him sat an older woman who smiled politely and went back to her meal. To his left, a young couple murmured to each other, heads close. No one asked who he was. No one seemed to care. It was strangely comforting. He ate slowly, listening. Stories drifted around him in pieces. Someone complaining about a landlord. Someone else talking about a job interview. A child explaining loudly why dinosaurs would still be alive if it weren't for the meteor. Daniel smiled to himself. After the plates were cleared, the man from earlier appeared again. "We could use help stacking chairs," he said. "If you're up for it." Daniel stood. "Sure." They worked side by side, lifting and stacking, not talking much at first. Daniel's hands weren't used to this kind of work. He moved carefully, making sure not to drop anything. "I'm Luis," the man said eventually. "Daniel." Luis nodded. "You live nearby?" "Yes." "You come often?" Daniel shook his head. "First time." Luis smiled. "You'll come back." It wasn't a question. Daniel left that night with the faint ache of muscles he didn't usually use, and a warmth that stayed with him all the way home. He came back the next Thursday, and the one after that. He didn't tell anyone at the office. He didn't make announcements or ask for recognition. He just showed up, ate, helped, listened. Over time, people began to nod at him when he came in. Someone saved him a seat once. Another time, a woman asked if he could watch her bag while she went to the restroom. Small trusts, offered without ceremony. One evening, as he was wiping down a table, he heard a familiar voice. "Daniel?" He turned. Sarah stood near the doorway, her coat unbuttoned, snow melting in her hair. Emily was beside her, tugging off her mittens. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Emily broke into a grin. "It's you!" Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. "Hi, Emily." She ran over and wrapped her arms around his waist. He froze for half a second, then rested a hand lightly on her back. Sarah laughed softly. "I hope that's okay." "It's more than okay," Daniel said. Mark appeared behind them, carrying a tray someone had handed him. He stopped short when he saw Daniel. "Well," he said, "this is unexpected." "Seems like," Daniel replied. They stood there, smiling at each other, the awkwardness brief and gentle. "We come here sometimes," Sarah said. "Emily likes it. She says everyone eats together." Daniel nodded. "She's right." They sat at a table near the side. Emily talked through most of the meal, telling Daniel about school, about a class pet hamster, about how she'd lost her ribbon and found it again in the couch. Daniel listened. Really listened. At one point, Mark leaned back and watched them. "You're good with her," he said quietly. Daniel shrugged. "She makes it easy." Sarah studied him for a moment. "I'm glad you came. So am I." After dinner, as they were helping clean up, Emily tugged on Daniel's sleeve. "Do you live alone?" she asked. He hesitated. "Yes." She frowned. "Still, yes." She thought about that. You could come over sometimes. We have extra chairs. Daniel smiled. That's kind of you. She accepted that as a possibility, not a promise. Over the next few weeks, they kept running into each other, sometimes at the dinner, once at the grocery store, once at the park when the snow had finally begun to melt. Their conversations stayed light. Weather, work, Emily's endless observations. Daniel learned that Mark worked in logistics, that Sarah volunteered part-time and freelanced when she could, that they worried about money sometimes, but not in a way that consumed them. They didn't ask Daniel about his work. Not at first. One evening, after the dinner had ended, and Emily was helping stack napkins with intense concentration, Mark spoke. You don't have to answer this, he said. But what do you do, exactly? Daniel considered the room, the scuffed floors, the laughter echoing faintly from the kitchen. I run a company, he said. A few, actually. Mark nodded. That sounds busy. It can be, that's all? Daniel met his gaze. That's all. Mark accepted that. It wasn't until a month later that the truth surfaced, and it didn't come from Daniel. A local paper ran a small feature on corporate philanthropy in the city. Daniel's photo was there, unmistakable. Emily saw it first. That's him, she said, pointing. Sarah looked, then looked again. When Daniel arrived at the dinner that week, Sarah pulled him aside. You didn't tell us, she said gently. I didn't want it to matter, Daniel replied. She nodded. It doesn't. I just wanted to say, thank you for being here. As yourself. Daniel exhaled, relief washing through him. Later that night, as he walked home, the city lights reflected in puddles along the sidewalk. For the first time in years, Daniel realized something quietly profound. He hadn't been invited into someone else's life. He had simply shown up, and that somehow had changed everything. Spring came slowly that year, not in bright declarations or sudden warmth, but in small permissions, a coat left unbuttoned, a window cracked open at night, the sound of rain replacing snow against the pavement. Daniel noticed all of it. He found himself walking more. Not for exercise, exactly, just to feel the city moving around him. He still worked long hours, still carried the weight of decisions that affected more people than he liked to think about, but the edges of his days had softened. Thursday nights stayed marked on his calendar. Not labeled, just blocked. Sometimes he arrived early to help set up. Other times he came late, slipping into a chair without ceremony. Either way, the room seemed to make space for him now. Emily had stopped hugging him without warning. Instead, she waved when she saw him, like they had an understanding. She often brought him drawings, houses with smoke curling from chimneys, stick figures holding hands, suns that took up most of the page. This is you, she said once, pointing to a figure near the edge. You're tall. He smiled and thanked her and took the drawing home, placing it carefully on the counter before deciding where it belonged. Mark and Sarah never pushed. They never hinted. They never asked him to be more than what he already was. That made it harder. One evening after dinner, Daniel found himself sitting with Mark outside the community center, while Emily and Sarah finished up inside. The air was cool but gentle. Cars passed in slow streams. You seem lighter, Mark said, not looking at him. Daniel considered that. I feel different, Mark nodded. Yeah, I get that. They sat in silence for a while. My dad used to say, Mark continued, that loneliness isn't about being alone, it's about feeling unnecessary. Daniel felt that land somewhere deep. I used to think I was needed all the time, Daniel said. Turns out I just made myself useful. Mark glanced at him. There's a difference. Yes, Daniel said quietly. That night, Daniel went home and didn't turn on any lights right away. He stood in the doorway, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic. For the first time, the apartment didn't feel empty. It felt unfinished. The realization unsettled him. Over the next few weeks, that feeling followed him. In meetings, in elevators, in moments when he caught his reflection in glass and barely recognized the man staring back, he thought about choices, about how easily life became narrow without anyone noticing, about all the dinners he'd skipped, all the weekends he'd filled with work instead of people. Regret came softly, like a bruise you don't feel until you press on it. One Friday evening, Karen knocked on his office door. You have a minute? Of course. She sat down, hands folded. You've been different lately. Daniel smiled faintly. Is that a complaint? No, she said quickly. It's just, you leave earlier, you ask more questions. You listened in the last board meeting. He chuckled. I've always listened. She raised an eyebrow. You've heard. It's not the same. Daniel nodded. Fair. She hesitated. I just wanted to say, it's good. Whatever it is. Thank you, he said, meaning it. That weekend, Sarah invited him over. Not formally, not with expectation. Just a message that said, we're making too much soup. You're welcome to some if you're around. Daniel stared at the message longer than he should have. He went. Their home was modest and warm. Shoes by the door, a faint smell of garlic and bread. Emily showed him her room, her desk, her latest drawings. This one's our family, she said, then added after a pause, and you. Daniel swallowed. That's very kind. Dinner was simple. Soup, bread, laughter that rose and fell naturally. Daniel found himself talking more than usual, not about work, about childhood memories, about a dog he'd had once, about mistakes he'd made and never corrected. No one interrupted him. After dinner, Mark washed dishes while Sarah packed leftovers into containers. Emily sat beside Daniel on the couch, leaning against his arm without asking. You're not lonely anymore, she said. Daniel looked down at her. I still get lonely sometimes. She nodded, serious. That's okay. We all do. The simplicity of it nearly undid him. On his way home that night, Daniel felt the weight of a choice pressing closer, not a dramatic one, just a steady question. How much of himself was he willing to offer? Because showing up had consequences. Connection always did. It asked things of you, time, attention, vulnerability. At the office, a major expansion project crossed his desk, one that would require travel, long stretches away. The old version of him would have signed without hesitation. He didn't. He delayed, asked for alternatives, requested shared leadership. People noticed. Some didn't like it. Late one evening, alone in his office, Daniel opened Emily's drawing again. The one with the stick figures. He traced the lines lightly with his finger. He thought about how easily he could step back, fade out, return to the safe, quiet distance he'd mastered, and how much it would cost him now. The next Thursday, he arrived at the community center later than usual. Emily ran up to him. You're late. I know, he said. I'm sorry. She studied him. Are you leaving? The question startled him. No, why? She shrugged. Sometimes people do. Daniel knelt to her level. I'm still here. She searched his face, then nodded, satisfied. That night, as Daniel helped stack chairs, he felt the full weight of what he had stepped into. Not obligation, belonging, and with it, the quiet fear of loss. Summer arrived without asking Daniel's permission. One morning, he stepped outside and realized he'd left his jacket behind. The air was warm already, the kind that promised long evenings and open windows. He paused on the sidewalk, surprised by how easily the season had changed while he wasn't paying attention. He liked that. Life had begun doing that lately, moving forward without waiting for him to approve every detail. Work still mattered, it always would. But it no longer sat at the center of everything else. He delegated more, trusted more, left things unfinished, and discovered the world didn't collapse because of it. On Thursdays, he still went to the community center. On some Sundays, he went to Mark and Sarah's place. Those visits were never announced as invitations. They happened naturally. A text about leftover food, a question about borrowing something, an offhand mention that they'd be at the park if he wanted to join. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. The important part was that the choice existed. One evening, Daniel arrived at their place carrying a small bag. Nothing special, just strawberries he'd passed at a stand on the way over. Emily met him at the door, already barefoot, her hair pulled back haphazardly. You're late, she said, smiling. I'm right on time. He replied. She considered that, then nodded and took the bag from him like it was expected. Dinner happened the way it usually did. Conversation overlapping, fork scraping, the occasional pause when someone realized they were full but kept eating anyway. Afterward, Mark went to fix something in the other room, and Sarah started packing lunches for the next day. Emily climbed onto the couch and patted the space beside her. Daniel sat. They watched a movie, something animated and loud and far too energetic for him to follow closely. He didn't mind. The sound of it filled the room, and that felt like enough. Halfway through, Emily's head tipped against his arm. He didn't move. He had learned that some moments only existed if you didn't try to hold them. Later, as he stood to leave, Sarah walked him to the door. "You don't have to go," she said, gently, not insisting. "Just stating an option." "I know," Daniel said, "but I will." She smiled. "See you Thursday?" "Yes." That word came easily now. At home, Daniel noticed how his apartment had changed, not physically. The furniture was the same, the walls still bare in places, but there were signs now. A child's drawing framed and hung near the kitchen, an extra toothbrush in the bathroom, shoes by the door that weren't his. He hadn't planned any of it. He hadn't even noticed when it started. He stood in the living room and realized something quietly important. He was no longer arranging his life to avoid emptiness. He was arranging it to make room. In early autumn, Daniel took a step that surprised even him. He invited them over, not for anything big, just dinner. He worried more than he should have. About the food. About the space. About whether his home would feel too much like what it was. A place designed for one person who never expected anyone to stay. Emily walked in and immediately took off her shoes. "This place is quiet," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied. "It used to be." She wandered through the rooms, touching things, opening nothing without asking. When she reached the living room, she stopped. "Can I hang my picture here?" she asked, holding up a new drawing. "Of course." She taped it slightly crooked. Daniel didn't fix it. Dinner was simple, a little awkward, honest. Mark asked questions. Sarah laughed at something Daniel said, and then laughed again because she'd laughed too hard. Emily spilled her drink and apologized so seriously it made Daniel smile. At one point, Mark looked around. "You okay?" he asked. Daniel nodded. More than okay. Later that night, after they left, Daniel stood alone in the quiet again, but it was different. Now, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like rest. Winter returned, slowly. The city cooled, the days shortened. Decorations appeared again in windows and on lampposts. Daniel noticed the first wreath of the season and felt something stir. Not dread this time, but recognition. Christmas came back around. Not loudly, not with announcement, just as a date on the calendar that no longer felt heavy. On Christmas Eve, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, writing cards. Not many, but more than none. He paused over one envelope, then wrote carefully. The next evening, he stood outside a familiar restaurant. The same one. It was decorated again. The wreath a little straighter this year. The lights just as war. He didn't go in alone. Mark held the door. Sarah followed. Emily ran ahead. Inside, a table waited near the window. 4 chairs. They sat. As menus were passed around, Emily looked up at Daniel. "Remember when you were lonely?" she asked. He smiled. "I do." She nodded, satisfied. "You're not now." Daniel looked around the table. At the small movements, the shared glances, the unremarkable miracle of being included. "No," he said softly, "I'm not." He didn't think about how it had changed his life. Not in big terms, just in the way his days now held other people. In the way time felt shared instead of spent. In the way he no longer ate dinner pretending it didn't matter who sat across from him. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, the lights stayed warm. And that was enough. End of part 5. Final ending. People often imagine that lives change in moments of great decision. Daniel knew better now. His life hadn't changed when a company succeeded or failed, not when he signed papers or closed deals, not even when he chose to step back. It changed when a little girl noticed an empty chair, when she asked a simple question without understanding how heavy it was, and when he answered without thinking too much about the consequences. There were still quiet nights, still moments of doubt, still days when loneliness brushed past him like a memory. But now it didn't stay. Now there was a place he could go, a table where his presence mattered, a life that no longer needed to be full to feel complete, just shared. And sometimes that was the most profound change of all.